So, welcome. Welcome back and good afternoon, everybody. And welcome back to our special series of Thursday webinars designed exclusively for you, our close friends and supporters. Today, as we did last week, we return to Jerusalem and to the JTS Shokin Institute to learn Torah with Rabbi Matt Berkowitz, our JTS Director of Israel Programs. And before Matt's teaching, we will learn more about the rare collection of the Shokin Library with its Deputy Director, Danny Hacker. Danny will begin the presentation, and when he concludes, we invite your questions and comments, and you can do that by either raising your hand in the lower left toolbar under Participants panel, or you can send me a chat and I will call upon you. And then after Danny, Matt will help us study Psalm 23. And after his teaching, he again is happy to take your questions and comments. Please remember to stay on mute during the presentations. And now a warm welcome back to Rabbi Matt Berkowitz and Danny Hacker. Welcome, Matt and Danny.
Joan, thank you so much for your introduction. And I also want to thank Naiza, who's behind the scenes taking care of all of the technology and making sure that everything flows smoothly. So thank you both for all you're doing to facilitate this session. It's my privilege and honor to say Bruchim Habayim, to welcome you back to the Jewish Theological Seminary's campus in Jerusalem, the Shokin Institute and Library. I'm greeting you once again from the main lecture hall of the Shokin Library. We're located right on Balfour Street, just across from the Prime Minister's residence in the heart of Jerusalem. For the past 10 years, this building, this location, has been the home to our rabbinical and cantorial students who learn in Israel as part of their curriculum. The building itself, as I mentioned last week, is a historical landmark in Jerusalem, and it has fascinating and emotional history. We have our patron and angel, Zalman Shokin, Zichrono Livracha, to thank for gifting us with this magnificent building in 1961. He had the vision and foresight to build this building between 1934 and 1937 as a refuge for his historic, rare Hebrew book and manuscript collection. That is the collection that you see just behind me. And indeed, the entire room that I'm sitting in is surrounded by rare Hebrew books and manuscripts. Indeed, I feel like I'm receiving very, very special energy and inspiration seated in this room. So without further ado, I want to hand over the bima to our amazing and treasured librarian here at the Jewish Theological Seminary, and that is Danny Hacker. You all know how much of a treat you're in for if you tuned in with us last week. Enjoy Danny's presentation. Immediately after Danny's presentation, you'll have an opportunity to ask some questions on the fascinating material that he's about to present. Danny.
Hi, everyone. Let's share a screen with you. Okay. Last week, we talked about recent edition of Tehillim, one from the 20th century. Today, I want to go back and I want to talk about the first printed edition of the Hebrew Psalms. And I want to begin with a few words about early print, and I'll try to do it quickly so it wouldn't take out of Rabbi Matt's time. We call early prints incunabula. It's from the Latin. It's literally, it means swaddling clothes. But what we mean it to be when we talk about books is the cradle of printing or infancy of printing. Printing was brought to Europe and essentially made what it is by Johann Gutenberg in 1450 with the invention of the printing press and movable type. And when we talk about in Conabula, the infancy of printing, we talk about the first 50 years of print, and from 1450 to 1500. And we treat this as a different type of books because it's still in an era where books were basically still a printed manuscript. Still, people did not understand the full capacity of print and the full effect the print will have. And if we look at in Conabula in Christian books, we see nearly 30,000 titles that have survived and kept in libraries today in over 500,000 copies. So we talk about movable type just for a minute, just to explain. If somebody wanted to print a book, he had to make his own letters. So he would design them. Somebody would carve them into a punch that you see here on the left, and then they'd make many letters out of that one design and set it on a tablet. They had to set it like opposite, like mirror. So it was a bit of work, and there were people whose job was to fix that letters on the table so it could then be imprinted on paper. You see here a picture of what a printing house would look like. This is from the 16th century, but it stands also for earlier. You can see here the letters are kept in this little boxes, and they had to set it in the tables, on the tables. So set it the opposite way, and you can see always there's somebody looking and checking to see that there's no mistakes. Then after that, you can see the table here, somebody is applying ink to that table. That's what he has, that's what he's holding in his hands. And after they applied the ink, they would put it here under the press on the right side and put a paper on it and then press. So in that way, the letters would be imprinted on paper. So it was quite a, I'd say, complicated project to print a book, but it was much cheaper than creating a manuscript, because once you created a book, you created many copies of it. You were able to produce copies. That was a big difference. Most famously, the first important printed book is the Gutenberg Bible that was printed in Germany, in Mainz, around 1455. And what I want you to see in this picture is, although it's a printed book, people were still regarding it as a manuscript. So there was place left on the printed page to add ornaments in handwriting, and every copy that survived has ornaments on it. When we come to talk about Hebrew in Conabula, we're talking about a whole different story. And instead of 30,000 titles, if we look at the titles that have survived to us today, we're talking about approximately 150 titles alone of books that printed in Hebrew up until 1500. And roughly speaking, 2,000 copies in libraries around the world. And the largest collection, a beautiful collection, the most important collection of Hebrew in Conabula is at the JTS in New York. It's one of the greatest collections in the world. And the main places where people are printing, there's actually two places. It's the Italian and Iberian Peninsula. Italian Peninsula because there was still no Italy at the time, but we're basically talking about Italy. And Iberian Peninsula means Spain and then later Portugal. But because of the expulsion of Jews from Spain in 1492, printing in Spain stops at that time. And in Portugal a little later, in 1496. So when we try and look at Hebrew books and try to think what was the first Hebrew book to be printed, we don't really have a Gutenberg Bible. There's no one book that we can say was the first. because in many of these books that were printed before 1500, we don't have the date. Sometimes we don't have the place. So today, we talk about 6 titles that were printed in Rome around the years 1469 to 72. We can't say for certain, but those books are considered to be the first books printed in Hebrew. But the famous book is the first dated Hebrew book, which is Rashi's commentary on the Torah. It was printed in Italy, in Reggio di Calabria in 1475. This book is extremely rare. There's only one copy of this book. It's kept in the Biblioteca Palatina in Parma in Italy. And the JTS holds 2 fragments from this book, 2 pages. This book, as you can see here, if you can see on the screen, I've just put a line under the date. In the end of the book, the printer says a few words about the process of printing the book. And he says the date, it's 5235, which is the year 1475. He says it was printed in Calabria, in Reggio di Calabria. It also tells us it was in Yud Adar. So we can say for certain that it's Italy in 1475. Another interesting thing about this book, this is actually not the first Rashi's commentary to be printed. One was printed already in Rome. Rashi's commentary was very popular. But this book was printed by a man called Avraham Graton, who we assume was a Spaniard who printed this book in Italy and probably took the books with him back to Spain to sell it. Because in 1475, there was still no Hebrew print in Spain. How do we know he was Spanish? If we look at the letters of the font that he uses, because like I said, printers did not have fonts to choose from. They had to create their own characters, their own letters. And usually what they did at that time, in the first 50 years, is they used their handwriting. So many times we'll see books from that era who might look a bit like handwriting and not print. We're used to the later square letters in print. And when Avraham Graton printed this Rashi, he printed it in his own handwriting and characters that were based on his handwriting, which is a Spanish handwriting. So it became that Rashi, and what we call today Rashi letter, Rashi type, Otiyot Rashi, is not really, the one thing that we can say for sure that it wasn't Rashi's handwriting, because Rashi lived in 12th century France, and he didn't write in this Spanish handwriting. And this is a sort of example of how this early printing, the effect that they had on culture and society after this. We called it Otiyot Rashi because it was printed in this type of letters. But they did not know that it would have this effect. I'll show you another example, again, of a book printed in Italy from our collection. This is called Bchinat Olam, was printed in 1473. And you can see here the letters, again, they almost look like they were written in handwriting. And I want you also to see that there's no title page. This is how the book starts on the right. And when it ends, it has the 3 lines in the end, which we call a colophon. It's usually at the end of a book or a manuscript. And there's a few, usually there's information about where this thing was copied or printed. So some information about the making of the book. And a nice example from this book that there's a woman involved in printing this book. A woman named Estelina Conat was the wife of Avraham Conat, who was a printer in Mantua. And she says, Anochi Estelina katavti zot ha'igeret. What does she mean katavti? Katavti, when we translate it, is wrote. but she's not the author of this work. She wrote Katafti because she didn't have the word Hetpasti. There was no word for printing in Hebrew at that time. This was still very early. So she says wrote, but she means printed. So let's talk about a few of the characteristics of Hebrew Inkunabula. So we don't always have all the information we want to know. Usually there's no numbering of pages. So you can't tell someone, you look at that book at page 15 or so, they didn't understand the meaning of having many copies of one book. So many times we won't have numbering, we won't have table of contents or indexes. We don't have a title page like we know. And many times the information about printer, place of print, or date is just not there. So we have to guess or estimate based on what type of paper was used, what type of letters, and so on. Another thing is additions. Mainly what people did is took a manuscript that they had at their collection or got from somebody and just copied it and made it into a book. They didn't realize, they didn't have that notion of making an edition, of using several manuscripts and find the best edition of the text. And if we're talking about what type of material was printed in Hebrew before 1500, out of those 150 titles, only 2 titles were printed by authors that were still alive. The great majority were books, were classics, either Rashi or Halacha books like Turim and commentary on the Bible and other stuff. But basically going back to the great rabbis, to the great sages. And if we're talking about printing the Bible in Hebrew, when we look at Hebrew Inkunabula as a whole, about 38% of those books are biblical text, either commentaries, text with commentaries, or only text. So it takes a big part, a big chunk of the books printed before 1500. So now we go to the question of what is the first printed biblical text in Hebrew? And the first book printed, the first biblical text printed in Hebrew is the Tehillim. And this edition of the Tehillim is a folio edition, it's a big book. Tehillim with commentary by Kimchi, David Kimchi, Radak. It was published in Italy, we don't know where in Italy, in 1477. So this is the first dated Tehillim. There is a question if there's another Tehillim that might have been printed maybe a year before, but that doesn't have a date, so we can't say for certain. So when we look at this Tehillim, again, the first thing I want you to see is how this book starts. There's not even a title. You see, the first, it's only Amar ben Yosef ben Kimchi Asfaradi. It begins immediately with the text. And then you can see how the page is set. We have one pasuk, one verse, and then after that verse, you have the commentary of David Kimchi on every couple of words. So you don't really get the whole chapter. You don't get the whole Mizmor, the whole Tehillim. You get it line by line. So why start with Tehillim? Why didn't we start like the Christians? Why didn't we have Gutenberg Bible? Why wasn't it printed so early? And so Tehillim was a very prominent book, both in Christian world and in Jewish world. Actually, the second important book printed by Christians was an edition of Tehillim in Latin that was printed in Mainz in 1455 by the, sorry, I forgot the word, business, never mind, people who worked with Gutenberg. And we might assume that maybe printing Tehillim in Hebrew was going in a safe way. Choose a text that also comfortable for Christians, because we know from the 16th century, we know that there's censorship, and we know that there's problem printing specific Hebrew books. For example, the Talmud is a very questionable book to publish because it stirs, it has problem with the Christian audience. In the 16th century, in the middle of the 16th century, there's burning of the Talmud in Italy. So we might assume maybe they chose a text that would go well with Christians as well. But when we look at this edition, the Radak's commentary, Kimchi's commentary on the Tehillim is very polemic. And I want to show you some short examples of this. I'll just read it. When he comments on a couple of Tehillim, and the Christians interpret it of Jesus, building on the verse, "The Lord said unto me, thou art my son. For if they should say to you that he was the son of God, answer that it is not proper to say son of God in the manner of flesh and blood, for a son is of the species of his father. Thus, it would not be proper to say, this horse is the son of Reuben." You can see that he's very direct in his, he doesn't choose his words, I'd say. I'll show you another example of it from a different Tehillim chapter. The Christian interpret this psalm about Jesus. They say that the first verse refers to the Father and the Son, since they read, "The Lord say to the Lord." They read Adonai instead of, we read Adoni, which is Lord in the sense of my master, not God. So they read it as though the Lord said to the Lord, so there's a Father and the Son, and then they add the Holy Spirit. And another mistake they make is they read, again, they change Imcha. They change Amcha to Imcha. And here you see Radak talking about the Latin translation of the Bible, the famous Hieronymus Vulgata, the holy translation of the Bible to Latin. And here you can see that Kimchi is being very critical, and he's saying he's wrong. So in a sense, by printing this specific commentary on Tehillim, which if we look at later editions of Kimchi's on Tehillim, he's not printed with all of this criticism. What they do is they don't print this bits. They print a smaller edition. For hundreds of years after this book, they don't print the complete commentary of Radak. So in a sense, at this time, still not understanding the full power of the print and the book. So maybe Christians were not that observant of what the Jews were doing. And what they do here is, in a sense, reclaim the Tehillim, not as a Christian text, almost part of the New Testament, but as the original Hebrew text with the Jewish traditional understanding of it. So why wait so long to publish biblical text? Why does it take almost 10 years to publish a biblical text? And it takes more. Only in 1985 is the Bible completely printed in the way that we know it today. So why does it take so long? So there's a couple of opinions. One is that it might be profane to take a sacred text and put it to print. Another is that maybe this was a financial decision. Maybe knowing that people were more familiar with the text, maybe knew it by heart, or had manuscripts of it, which were more popular. So maybe that's the reason why it took a while for biblical text to be printed. But there's another reason, which I like much more, it's a more prosaic reason. And, you know, before the Tehillim that we're talking about in 1477, there's 6 books of commentaries that were printed without the text. Here's one example for one of those Roman prints. And you can see here, this is Nachmanides' commentary on the Torah, and you can see it has Bereshit Bara and then the commentary. And if we go back to our Tehillim and look at the lines that I highlighted, what you see here is the nikud, the vocalization, the vowel points. You can see underneath the letters, there's signs telling us how to read the letter. And basically, the reason that the Bible was not printed, it took a while for the Bible to be printed, is because of a technical difficulty of applying this type of signs that Christian didn't have to worry about, because they don't have nikud, they only have the letters. Another thing that you can see here, there's no dagesh. Dagesh is the point that sometimes in the middle of the letter, suggesting, again, how to read it. And another thing that's not here is the ta'amei mikra, the cantillations, how we sing, how we vocalize the psukim. And an interesting thing about this 1477 Tehillim, and this is why I chose page 7 of the edition, is because in this page, after Lamnatzeach al Shminit Mizmor LeDavid, after this verse, we don't see vocalization again in the whole book. So they started off trying to do this nikud, trying to add it to the text, but apparently it was too difficult technically, either for the people who were doing it technically, or the people who had to decide which nikud had to be to each and every word. So they stopped after not that much, after 7 pages. And I want to show you just a small example. This is a matrix. This is the letters that were used in the printing house of Daniel Bomberg. It's a very important 16th century printer. And you can see on the 3rd line that you have letters with a hole in the middle. And that was to create dagesh, to create that dot in the middle of the letter. So you can see that if you wanted to do this in a book, you'd have to make twice as much letters as normally. So those technical issues led to the fact that it took a while until the Bible was published with nikud, with ta'amei mikra, as we know it. I want to take a short look at the colophon at the end of the book, just to see a little about what the printers wanted to tell us, the readers, about this edition, and how excited they were about completing this book. So when the art of printing books was refined, with movable type set up in rows, by this process, 300 copies were made, grand and luxurious, Tehillim with the commentary of Kimchi, which shine brightly like sapphires in the eyes of their beholders. So the printers of the book tell us that they made 300 copies of this book. It's rare that we have this kind of information about a book at that time. And also we can see how excited they are about this new invention of print. I'm going to skip this one for now. And I'm going to look at the little end of this colophon and about the people who printed this book, and they tell us who they are. And I'm just going to look at the last couple of sentences. This is our prayer, those who executed the work, those who printed the book, and their name, Master Yosef and Neriah, Chaim, Mordechai and Chizkiah, Montero. And I just want to show you, in some editions, we have the Neriah. You can see here there's no Neriah. On other copies of the book, there is Neriah. And we also have a problem reading this because we can read it as, for example, Master Yosef and Neriah, Chaim, two people, maybe brothers with the name Chaim, and Mordechai v'Chizkiah, either Montero or Meh from Venturo. There's a way to read it that there's 3 people and not 4 people. The thing is, we don't have any evidence of who these people were from anywhere else except what they left on this edition of the Tehillim. This is all we know about them. And it's great to have this book so many years. It's 450 years or so after this book was printed, and that it remains as evidence of what they did. Shoken was a great collector of Hebrew incunabula. By 1930, he had 64 titles in his collection, which he then donated to the National Library in Israel. After that, he kept collecting incunabulas, Hebrew incunabulas. He managed to collect another 40 or so. Some of them are still here in this collection, like the ones that we're talking about. In 1937 and 1938, the work, we talked last week about the printing house of Shoken. The directors of the printing house decided to give Shoken a present for his 60th birthday, and they made a facsimile of this book of the Tehillim of 1477. They chose this book for 2 reasons. One was that it's an exceptional book and it's an important book. The other was that Reish Lamed Zayin, 1477, is 400 years before Shoken was born in 1877. So they used this, and Shoken was a very old world type of person, and for every occasion, they made some book or some present to give him for his birthday or for stuff like that. And they added a letter to Shoken, and I'll read it there very quickly, and this is gonna be the end of my part. The Book of Psalms with the commentary of Kimchi was printed in 1477. This print is the first print of the Bible in Hebrew. Not only that, but this very important edition is one of the few to have the entire Kimchi commentary. And because this book is very rare, and even the few copies that remain are usually damaged and missing pages, after we were able to use a clean and complete copy like no other from the collection of the Jewish Theological Seminary in Breslau, we decided to photograph it and copy it and reprint it in a small edition for the benefit of the public, and especially to bring joy to the heart of the book lover and scholar, Mr. Zalman Shoken, on his 60th birthday. The specific copy that was used for the facsimiles today sits in the National Library in Israel. You can see it here, the cover of it. And I just want to go back to what I skipped before. And it's the prayer that the printer of this book wrote in the end of the book. They say, "May we be granted to meditate and study these books, we and all the children of our people, for all eternity from generation to generation, to learn and to teach, to observe, to perform and fulfill all that is written therein. May the creator of all creature grant it to us." The endeavor that they took 450 years ago is people that we know nothing about from any other source. We are very lucky today to have not only 1 or 2 copies of this book. In 1938, when they made the facsimile, said it was very rare, but actually there's almost 30 copies of this book that survived. There's also one in the JTS collection in New York. And it's great that we can fulfill their tefillah to study from this book and this is where I give the give it back to you, Rabbi Matt, or maybe some questions now.
Hi.
Joan, if we have questions that we'd like to take, we're welcome to do so now.
This was just fabulous. I hope we can learn some more of about these books in the future. Just incredibly informing.
I'm just looking at the, wait a second. I'm just looking at the chat and see, are there any questions?
I don't see anybody. Any other comments before we move on to Matt? Sometimes it takes a while for them to generate.
It's okay.
If not, during my presentation, I urge you to continue thinking of questions for Dani. You'll have another opportunity towards the end of our session to ask questions both on the first part, Dani's presentation, and I want to echo what Sandy just said in the chat, Yashar Koach Dani. Dani, this was an archaeological dig into a treasured piece of literature that sits here in the Shokin collection. And you are a very, very talented archaeologist. I should say literary archaeologist. Your passion comes through, your great interests, and your academic precision in sharing with us some of the wonderful discoveries that you made in taking a look at this edition of Tehillim, of the Book of Psalms, and Radak's commentary, and then bringing it forward into Zalman Shokin's time. So thank you so much, Dani.
Actually, we do have a couple of questions on the chat now. One is from Larry Silver and another from Ron Fetterman. Larry?
My question was about the contributions of Venice, which I know was an early area that printed Hebrew books. I know the name Aldous Manutius, but I don't know the name of specialist Jewish publishers, and I'm curious if you could tell us just a little bit about the contributions from Venice.
Sure. Manutius is famously the greatest printer of the Renaissance, but Manutius did not print Hebrew. The first Hebrew printer in Venice was Daniel Bomberg, who was not a Jew, was actually a Christian, was a Hebraist, a Christian who studied Hebrew and was very interested in going back to Hebrew as the original language of the scripture. And but there was no Jews allowed to live in Venice up until basically 1520 or so, with the Jewish ghetto in Venice. So there were no Jewish printers in Venice, and it's supposedly Manutius wanted or planned to print in Hebrew, but he didn't get to it, and he tried to stop anyone else who wanted to print in Hebrew. So only after his death, there started to be printing of Hebrew books in Venice. And that was very important because Venice was the place of printing books in the beginning of the 16th century. So Bomberg's printing house is extremely important, but it's a little later. It's from 1519 on or so.
And you showed us the type from Bomberg.
Yeah, I showed you the type because I wanted to show the dagesh. I wanted to show that there's, you had to make more letters if you wanted to do this vocalization thing. So it was very expensive. And Bomberg himself was a very rich man. He was a dealer of spices and art. And he was able, because he was wealthy, he was also the first one to print the complete set of the Babylonian Talmud, to print all the volumes, which was a very expensive project. But that is a little later. That comes a bit after what we're talking about, what we talked about today.
And Ron Fetterman, did you have a question before we move on to Matt?
Yes, I just wanted to ask if there are any books that survived the great libraries of Vilna or in Germany and Berlin survived the Shoah. And the second question was, do they have any idea what's in the Vatican has in their underground libraries that they have been very reluctant to open to study?
Well, for the first question is obviously not only the Shoah, but there was a lot of book burnings in ancient history. In like I said, in the 16th century, there was burning of the Talmud in Italy, and many copies were burned. But still, a lot of books have remained. So if we're talking about, for example, in Conabula, we know that there's probably more than 150 titles that were made, but it's only 150 titles that survive to this day. And if you're talking specifically about collections like the one of the Jewish Theological Seminary in Breslau, it's a very long story of what happened with the books. It's a project between Israel and the United States. It wasn't Israel at that time, but Gershom Scholem from Israel as a representative of the Jewish people and the Hebrew University, and efforts from America to save those books that not all of them were born. Most of them were taken and put in big warehouses around Germany. So it's a very interesting story, but it's a very long one. So I can't say more right now. And the second question was, I'm sorry, I forgot.
about the Vatican and some of their.
There is a catalog of the collection in the Vatican that was made by an important scholar of Hebrew books in Hebrew manuscripts called Malachi Bet Aryeh. That was done. Does it include each and every book? Are there treasures that we don't know about? I don't know. But there is a catalog of the important manuscripts that are in the Vatican. So we know what's in the collection. Okay.
Thank you so much, Danny.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your question. Again, if you have more questions, please think of them, write them into chat, and towards the end of the session, we'll take a look and we'll make every attempt to address those questions, though I suspect that we will need another series like this to begin to mine Danny's knowledge of this vast collection. Thank you so much, Danny. What I want to do now is I want to transition to our study of the Book of Psalms. Last time we met, we studied Shir Hamalot, the psalm that we recite, Birkat Hamazon, the introductory psalm that's recited on Shabbat, on festivals. And today, what I want to do with you is I want to study a psalm that is very, very familiar to us, and that is Psalm 23. One of the aspects that interests academics, rabbinic commentators, when they look at the different psalms, remember, we have a collection of 150 psalms. That's the total number of psalms in the Book of Psalms. And when we look at each of those psalms, we want to understand essentially the original setting in which each psalm was recited. And sometimes we have both implicit and explicit clues to the setting in which the psalm was recited based on the language of that particular psalm. This psalm proves to be quite challenging in terms of understanding its original cultic, in quote, setting. It may have been part of a ritual of thanksgiving that either took place in the temple or in people's homes, that is to say, in their Mikdash Ma'at. It may not have been part of temple worship at all, and the psalm that we're about to read is simply a pious Jew's expression of faith. Another possibility is that this particular psalm is connected in broad strokes to the idea of exile. And what it does is it provides hope for the exiled community that is cut off from home writ large, that is the land of Israel, and that is cut off from the temple, cut off from the destroyed temple. So I wanted to begin there with some of the complexity of understanding the original setting in which the psalm was recited, and also with this quote from Bible scholar Peter Craigie, who's a Bible scholar at the University of Calgary, and he writes the following, quote, "There are few psalms in the Psalter which are so well loved and so well known as Psalm 23. Its appeal lies partly in the simplicity and beauty of its poetry, strengthened by the serene confidence which it exudes. But more than that, the genius of the psalmist is to be found in his extraordinary expression of a trusting relationship with God," unquote. Okay, I love that quote from Craigie, and it just about says it all in terms of the structure and content of this particular work. I also want to share a bit of Shakespeare with you, who once said that opposites juxtaposed one to another shine all the more. It's helpful to take a glance quickly at the psalm that immediately precedes Psalm 23, Psalm 22. I'm just going to read a few of the introductory verses of Psalm 22, and you'll immediately understand what I'm getting at. So from verse 2 in Psalm 22, we read, my God, why have you abandoned me? Why so far from delivering me and from my anguished roaring? My God, I cry by day, you answer not, by night, and have no respite." Okay, so very, very quickly, you understand that Psalm 22 is the polar opposite of what we're about to read in Psalm 23. It's the polar opposite of the spiritual posture or stance that we're about to immerse ourselves in now. And the crucial point is that our spiritual lives are dynamic. Here you've got Psalm 22, in which you have a psalmist crying out who's suffering in loneliness, in tragedy, and is wondering out loud, right, in a piercing way, where is God? Right? And then you take that and you juxtapose it to Psalm 23, which expresses this calm confidence in feeling quite strongly that God is there. I don't want you to feel beaten down by a sense of disappointment as we go forward into Psalm 23, that you don't measure up to the psalmist who wrote Psalm 23. Few of us really do measure up to this particular author, this particular psalmist. So I want you to keep that in mind. The beauty of Psalms is that it's dynamic, that it represents different personalities, different authors, different Jews at different moments in our lives. And that's how you should understand this as you read it chapter by chapter. And hopefully these two sessions are inspiring you to do just that. Let's take a step back. Joan, I want to ask you if you could please share screen on the Psalm and make sure you're split screen so that you're seeing the Psalm and the other participants, or the Psalm and me as we go forward. So I want to take a step back with the very, very beginning of the Psalm, and that is where we read a Psalm of David, Mizmor LeDavid. Okay, what is that telling us about the authorship of this particular Psalm? And in general, what does it tell us about the authorship of Psalms in general? Okay, we want to get to the text of Psalm 23, not this one. There we are. Okay, so if we could make that a bit larger. Okay, we're at a Psalm of David. So what you need to know in general is that there are 116 Psalms, 116 out of the 150 that we have, that are titled. Okay, the people that are identified in the book of Psalms, in those title notes, those introductory lines, are David, Solomon, Moses, Asaph, Heman, Ethan, sons of Korah, and Lamnatseach, a musical director or conductor. And one of the questions that we have is, does this designation convey exact authorship of the psalm to us, right? In other words, when we read a Psalm of David, is it telling us directly that David wrote the psalm, right? And what I want to say is that the answer or the question is found in one tiny Hebrew letter, and that is the letter Lamed. Okay, you see Mizmor Lih David. So the question is, what does the Lamed, what does the Lih mean? The Lamed could mean it's a psalm for David, a psalm by David, a psalm to David, a psalm concerning or about David, or a psalm for the use of David. You're beginning to see how complicated all this is, right? All of that, right, is in one Hebrew letter. So obviously the question that we have is, did David compose this psalm? To what extent, right? Tradition tells us that King David composed the Psalter, right? The entire book of Psalms. And there is a very, very compelling argument to be made for that. Okay, I want to read to you from Craigie's commentary. And he writes the following. He says, the strong possibility remains that in some cases the Psalter contains psalms composed by David. In historical and prophetical narratives, David is frequently associated with music and psalmody. He is called the sweet psalmist of Israel in the second book of Samuel. He is credited with inventing musical instruments in the book of Amos. He is said to have appointed singers and musicians and assigned them to their roles in the worship of God. At a later date, music and worship were specified as being undertaken according to the directions of David. We know this from the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, and several poetic passages in the historical narratives are directly associated with him. The probability remains, therefore, that a number of the Psalms in the Psalter, which are associated with David, may be Davidic compositions. All of that to say is, I want to believe tonight that this psalm was written by King David. And one of the reasons that I want to say that is the psalm, you will see, is divided into two sections. Right? The first section, it has the psalmist likening himself to a lamb. God is the shepherd and the psalmist is the lamb. And the second section, which begins with verse 5, has the psalmist comparing himself to a guest who is sitting in God's house. So why do I want to believe that it's King David? You may recall from the beginning of the David narrative in which we're introduced to King David, the prophet Samuel comes to the house of Yishai. Remember, King Saul is collapsing at this point. His kingship is collapsing because of his failure to kill King Agag, an Amalekite, right? And now we're about to anoint and appoint a new king in Israel. So Samuel goes out and reaches Beit Lechem, goes out to the city of Bethlehem, goes out to the elders of the town. He meets a certain man by the name of Yishai, sees a number of sons of Yishai, and suspects that it's the really muscular, good-looking one that he is going to anoint as king. But then God turns to Samuel and says the following, do not look at what you see of him or at the tallness of his stature, for I have rejected him. For not as human beings see does God see. Indeed, a human being sees the eyes, but God sees the heart. Right? One of my favorite lines, one of my most favorite verses of all of Tanakh right there, that humans see the eyes, but God looks deep inside and sees the heart. And then this narrative goes on, and Shmuel says to Yishai, right, do you have other children around? And Yishai responds, there still remains the youngest. Here, he is shepherding the flock. right? So right from the beginning of the David story, we know that David himself was a shepherd, just as other leaders of Israel are shepherds, right? It speaks volumes to one of the most important qualities of being a leader, not just in Israel, but being a leader in general, right? And that is caring for your flock, right? Caring for your people, right? The Midrash has God looking down upon these shepherds that was chosen to be our leaders, and God warmly says to God's self, I have seen how you have taken care of your animals, right, so beautifully, and now I want to place my precious people, my treasured possession, into your hands. So given that this metaphor is so strong and so dominant in the psalm, I do want to believe that there is a strong connection to the hand of King David here. So let's read together the first couple of verses. The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me to water. He leads me to water in places of repose. He renews my life. He guides me in right paths as befits his name. So let's pause there and let's unpack. Okay, we have this metaphor of God as a shepherd, and it's quite a common metaphor that we see throughout Tanakh. In Genesis 48, verse 15, Jacob says to God, God who has been my shepherd. In Psalms 80 and 95, God is also referred to as being a shepherd. Right? We're told, God is my shepherd and I lack nothing. Another way of understanding this particular verse is that it's linked to the Exodus from Egypt and the journey through the Midbar, the journey through the desert. And why do we link that so powerfully? Right, God acts as shepherd, leading the people from the land of Egypt to the promised land, the land of Israel. And in Deuteronomy chapter 2, verse 7, we read the following. It says there, again, Deuteronomy chapter 2, verse 7, indeed, the Lord your God has blessed you in all your undertakings. God has watched over your wanderings through this great wilderness. The Lord your God has been with you these past 40 years. You have lacked nothing. Lo chasarta davar. You have lacked nothing. Right? So there's a direct connection both in the idea itself and right in this notion of not lacking. Right, so God is my shepherd, I lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me to water in places of repose. In the Hebrew, it's literally to quiet waters. A shepherd ordinarily wanders his flocks or her flocks through wilderness, through the Midbar, until they reach a pasture. And then the shepherd will set up camp. A faithful shepherd will rest that flock by green grass, which is suitable for grazing, right? And why is this notion of calm water so important, right? Because it's about, right, being sensitive to the very, very calm nature of the lamb, right? The shepherd doesn't want the lamb to be scared by rushing waters, to be scared by a waterfall, right? So the shepherd will deliberately bring his or her flock to a place of calm waters, right? Then we read, he renews my life. He guides me in right paths as befits his name. Nafshi yishovev yancheni b'magle tzedek lema'an shemo. How do we understand nafshi yishovev? It's translated as he restores my soul. God restores my soul. Right? In other words, God brings my soul back to God. Right? The soul begins with God, right? And the soul ultimately will return with God, just as a shepherd does with a lamb. A shepherd will not let a lamb go astray. The shepherd the lamb begins its journey with the shepherd, right? And please God, the lamb will return back to the shepherd, right? And then, of course, this notion of being led in paths of righteousness, the Maglei Tzedek, for the sake of God's name. Then this verse, which feels like we're on the edge of a precipice. Though I walk through a valley of deepest darkness, I fear no harm, for you are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Gam ki elech begates al mavet, lo irara ki ata imadi. Shiftecha umishamtecha, hema yenachamuni. How do we understand this? Right? Sometimes a shepherd leads his or her flock through a ravine by steep cliffs that block out the sun, right? And this word that we see here is a very curious word, salmavet, right? Some grammatical scholars believe that it actually should be salmut and not salmavet. As salmavet, it seems that the word can be broken apart into two, as in tzel, the shadow, okay, tzel, shadow, and mavet, death, in the shadow of death, okay? And notice that JPS translates it here as a valley of deepest darkness, right? Other translations you'll see maybe the valley of the shadow of death, which is a translation that does exactly what I did before, right? Breaking apart that word salmavet into two and then reading it literally, right? I fear no harm, for you are with me, right? Imagine, okay, put yourself literally into the words, into the spirit of this psalm. This is the lamb talking to the shepherd, okay? I fear no harm, you are with me. Shiftecha, your rod. What is the rod used for? What does the shepherd use the rod for? The shepherd uses a rod to ward off wild animals, to keep wild animals away and to keep the flock safe. And of course, the shepherd also uses that same rod to guide the flock, right? To keep them going in one particular direction, right? To keep them along the path of Maglei Tzedek, to keep them along the path of righteousness, as it were. Mishamtecha, right? Not rod, but rather the staff, okay? And this refers very, very direct. What is the staff for? The staff is for the shepherd, right? It's the shepherd who is leaning on the staff, who uses the staff for stability, okay? So there we have both of those images, rod and staff, right? And the lamb says, they comfort me. Right? How do we understand the lamb? The lamb is not only literally a lamb, but the lamb is each of us reading the psalm, individual Israelites, as well as the people of Israel, right? And God, of course, as the shepherd. So you notice that the first half of this psalm is spoken in the third person voice, and now we are going to shift into the first person voice as we move to the second half of the psalm, in which the psalmist addresses God very directly and says the following. Remember, when I was talking about the structure, I mentioned we've got two parts. The first, in which the psalmist likens himself to a lamb. The second, in which the psalmist compares himself to a guest in God's house. And that is where we're transitioning now. So we read, you spread a table for me in full view of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My drink is abundant. Ta'aroch lefanai shulchan neged sorarai tishamta v'shemen roshi kosi rivaya. You spread a table before me. Right? The psalm is alluding to, right, the notion of hachnasat orchim, bringing guests into one's home. Right? There's this sense of the home as being a place of shelter, right? Or, right, as the rabbis tell us, the home is meant to be a mikdash ma'at, a sanctuary in miniature. So when the psalm says you prepare a table before me, it's highlighting the host's obligation to protect the guests. This we see with Lot in Genesis 19, verse 8, and then again in Sefer Shoftim in the book of Judges, chapter 19, verse 23. You anoint my head with oil, my drink is abundant. The symbols of wine and oil are often linked together, and they are symbols of joy and celebration in Jewish tradition. Only goodness and steadfast love shall pursue me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord for many long years. Ach tov v'chesed yirdefuni kol yemei chayai, vishavti bebeit Adonai la'orech yamim. The close of this prayer is a prayer both for tov, for that which is good, as well as a prayer for loving kindness. We want both of those to fill our lives, to fill the length of our days, right? And ultimately, we want to dwell in God's house, not only in this life, right, but also in the world to come, also in Olam Haba, as we say, right? The psalm is set up very, very beautifully. And what I also want to draw our attention to is that I am sure the psalm is familiar to you from the Yizkor services, right? On the Chagim, on the holidays, on the high holidays. Whenever we recite Yizkor, typically we conclude the Yizkor service with Psalm 23. And you also know the psalm well, right, from funerals, right? We recite Psalm 23 at funerals, right? Again, a moment in which we're grieving, in which we're in great pain, right? What does this psalm do? This psalm attaches us to some of the most comforting imagery we have in the tradition of God as shepherd, right? God being our rock, God being our salvation, right? And thinking of God as Mishantecha. God is also our staff. God is going to provide stability in this very, very difficult moment. Part of what's also fascinating is that many Sephardic Jews have a tradition of reciting the psalm just before Kiddush on Shabbat. When we say the blessing over the wine, right, they will recite this both Friday evening as well as Shabbat morning, Shabbat lunch, just before the recitation of the Kiddush, and it makes complete sense. When you look at the second half of the psalm, right, you spread a table for me in full view of my enemies, you anoint my head with oil, my drink is abundant, right? This, again, what I said before, the notion of having guests, right? So it makes complete sense, not only to associate this with a moment of death, but also to associate this with joy in our lives, to associate this with being surrounded by family and friends. I also want to point out, Kosi Revaya, JPS translates it as my drink is abundant. It's often translated as my cup overflowing. My cup overflows. Right? What for those of you who have been studying Megillat Ruth, the book of Ruth with me, you know well that Ruth's name is connected. What is the root of Ruth? Right? There are many rabbis that have mistakenly said that the root of Ruth, the name Ruth, is re'ut, friendship. It's not. I learned with my Bible professor at the Jewish Theological Seminary, Professor Ed Greenstein, who just won a major Bible prize here in Israel. Made Aliyah, went on to become a professor, Bible professor at Tel Aviv and Bar Ilan University. Professor Ed Greenstein taught me that the root of Ruth is Rivaya, Resh Vav He, overflowing, because Ruth is a character that overflows with chesed, overflows with loving kindness, just as in our psalm, this cup overflows. The last comment that I want to make before we take questions is the absolutely perfect artistry of this psalm in that, note well, it begins with God and it ends with God. Adonai Roi, God is my shepherd, and at the very end, Vishavti Beveit Adonai, I will dwell in the house of God. Okay, beginning with God, ending with God. And why am I bringing this to your attention? Because this psalm is so intimately connected to the life cycle. One of my most treasured teachers at the Jewish Theological Seminary was the dean of the rabbinical school at the time, and that is Rabbi William Lebo. Still a very treasured colleague and teacher of mine. And Rabbi Lebo taught us, you can imagine in senior seminar in rabbinical school, you talk deeply about theology, your personal theology, rabbinic theology. And Rabbi Lebo shared with us that he subscribes to a theology that believes that God enters our lives explicitly at two moments. When we are born, and for those of you who have been right in the birthing room, if you've given birth to a child, if you've been standing there as a witness, right, what do you see? Right, the child is born, right? There's this very, very fragile moment where you don't hear breath, right? And then suddenly, right, nishima, connected to nishama, the breath of life, the soul is literally breathed in to the infant at that moment. And Rabbi Lebo was saying to us that it's at that moment that God explicitly enters, places the soul, the breath of life in us. And then at the end of our lives, right, the last breath that we take, right, as the neshama leaves the body, the last nishima, the last breath that we have, as the soul leaves us. And I love that notion. I love how so beautifully it's reflected, it's mirrored in this psalm, with God beginning and then God ending. And I'm a true believer in what Rabbi Lebo taught us. I do not believe that that God is a micromanager, right? There is space for free will. There is space for covenantal relationship. There is space, freedom in our lives to make those important decisions. So I am a believer in that notion, and I believe that Psalm 23 reinforces that quite beautifully. Let me take a breath and give you a chance to ask some questions. Welcome to type questions into chat, and either about Danny's presentation or my presentation.
Rabbi, I am not going to talk about, I don't have a question, but I'm going to tell you that this has been an amazing class. I had not known much about the healing, and I find it wonderful. And the way you do it, it's beyond expression.
Thank you, Beatrice.
Thank you so much.
It makes it very easy to have a chavruta, to have a partner like Danny Hacker. And we're able to do this because we work as a team, and it's a gift to us to have students like you. So thank you. And I hope we'll figure out a way to continue this. Lots of hands up, Joan.
Shelley Gross?
So the question is, I have a question for Danny. They talked about what was printed first or why it wasn't printed quickly. And I understand all the reasons related to the fact that the Jews it was a very odd time, but could it have been related to the fact that anything new seems to be problematic, like anything very new seems to be problematic. In those days, the printing press was technology, as technology is today. And to print let's say holy manuscripts on something that would be for everybody or anybody, 300 copies of something, do you think that it was problematic? There was pushback in whether this was a good idea at the time.
I certainly think there's something in that. We don't really know the reasons. We can only speculate. And obviously, like you said, Chadash, Asur min Torah, and it takes time. But what's interesting is that once they manage to deal with the technical issues, they start printing it. They don't stop. They start printing a lot of editions of the Bible. So I'm sure there's an element of what you're saying that is true. But I think it's the combination of those reasons.
I'm not sure who the Phyllis G is.
I'm Larry.
Hi, Larry.
Matt, regarding Psalm 23, it's interesting that it's a comforting psalm, but it's in both parts of the psalm. There's always a specter of danger. There's the shadow of death. There's your enemies, and even though it sort of emphasizes the fact not only is somebody comforted by the shepherd, but there's always somebody there trying to harm you, and I have a protector, because otherwise there's no other way to explain it. It's the table in front of my enemies. It's a shadow of death. There's always some specter to be protected from.
Right. Yes, Larry, very well said. Right. I think we know well from watching the news these days, or just, stepping a few feet out of our homes, and feeling that sense of uncertainty, whether it be political uncertainty or, ethical, moral, whichever way you want to slice it. I believe that this is a snapshot of life, it is important. I remember a beautiful Dvar Torah given by Rabbi David Lincoln at Park Avenue Synagogue, one of the years that I was Rebbitzin there. And he was explaining Urei Betuv Yerushalayim, which is see the goodness in Jerusalem. And he said that what is Torah teaching us? It's telling us that you got to go out of your way sometimes to see goodness. You've got to make a real effort to see it, right? Because of what you're pointing out, because there is this specter of illness, this specter of enemies, thieves, people who will do us harm, right? But, at the same time, we've got to be able to balance that with an optimism, with a spiritual stance that really does enable us to see the goodness in Jerusalem.
Thank you.
Any further questions? You've all been, I know we've had a longer session than usual, but there's been so much, truly an overflowing session today, but beautiful in so many ways. Any other questions before we sign off for this week? I guess I want to thank you both. Oh, Shelley, one more?
I'm so sorry. It's kind of to both of them because it has to do with you bringing up the word, the root, where Ruth comes from, but it also has to do with the Hebrew of the nikudot. So it would be a problem to print with the nikudot because in a way the nikudot are an interpretation of how you pronounce a word. And where does that word come from? And I can only imagine a bunch of Jews sitting around, like arguing over how one word would be pronounced and what nikudot to use. I can't even imagine that anything has ever been printed. So I guess the question's to both of you.
All I want to say, Shelley, is that is why the Talmud, when you look at, how the Talmud is originally printed, and even in the Vilna edition of the Talmud that we have today, there are no nikudot. It's not vocalized. Right? Because the idea is it's meant to be left open totally to interpretation, right? So you may read something and it seems that there should be an exclamation point at the end of the sentence, but really it's a question mark at the end of the sentence, right? And it's part of the discipline of what it is to learn Talmud. It's because the rabbis wanted to preserve it as oral Torah. So it had to have this oral quality to it. Donnie? You want to jump in?
I'll just say that the Nikud is basically, we use a tradition, it's the Masoret Ktana, Masoret Gdola, which dates back to the first centuries. That's the tradition that presumably we use today. So it's not that they had to invent it, they had to know it. And know it meant having the manuscripts of that tradition, because it wasn't printed and they didn't have it in front of them. So it was a big problem just to have that text. That way you have some scholars like Eliyahu Levita, Eliyahu Bachur is called, he's a 16th century Jew, amazing Jew in the Renaissance, who writes about this Masorot of Nikud. So it's a big problem, like you say, but it's not like you have to invent it. It's more of having access to those ancient traditions of how to vocalize the text.
I'm going to take one more quick question from Ron Fetterman. Ron?
Yes, in the Chumash and elsewhere, there always are some errors in what is in the Ketiv and what is read, how it's spoken also, and how accurate were the earlier texts, biblical texts, the printed texts?
Okay, I have not done the research, but there are scholars of biblical text done. There's famously some issues between Christians and Jews about who has the better text. And even when Christian Hebraists, starting off in the end of the 15th century and forwards and onwards, they talk about how the Christian traditions are wrong, like Erasmus, for example, mentions it, and other. But sometimes you find, even to this day, some places in the Hebrew text, when you question, do our tradition also sometimes have some mistakes in it? And because we don't really know, we have a tradition, but we don't have anything from, let's say, the first century or so with Nikud, with those signs. It's only the tradition that was kept either verbally and later copied to text. So as much as we assume today that everything we do will have some mistakes in it, so it was obviously the same situation back then. And obviously within the centuries, it became more and more refined. But it's basically, even to this day, we don't know if the text is completely correct.
Thank you. Thank you.
Again, Matt and Donnie, I just want to thank you, and I think everyone is going to thank you for the past couple of weeks of great learning. And Donnie, as you closed out with your prayer, may we continue to study from both of you and your great minds. Very much appreciated. Thank you. And next week,
Shabbat Shalom from Jerusalem.
Shabbat Shalom. And
Shabbat Shalom, Shkoach to both of you.
Go. I'm sorry. Shabbat Shalom to everyone. Bye.
Just want to say next week, when we talked about Psalm 23 today in the sad context of funerals, as Matt mentioned, our guest next week will be Rabbi Naomi Kalish, who is the director of the JTS Center for Pastoral Education. And she's going to offer some guidance on how to deal with loss that many of us have faced during the COVID-19 crisis. So I do hope you'll tune in next Thursday at 12:30 for what should be a pretty meaningful conversation. Stay well, everyone. Stay healthy, and thanks for joining. Matt and Donnie, thank you again.
Pleasure. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Bye, Donnie.
Good evening.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you all.
Goodbye.
Hi,
Thank
Judy.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Joan?
Hey.
I'll call you. There's a few people I'm not sure of the last names.
Okay, call me.
Okay, thanks. Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Everybody have a good afternoon.
Again.
Bye-bye.
Bye.